Hello, and welcome to the Center for International Policy Studies and to the University of Ottawa. My name is Rita Abrahamson. I'm the director of CIPS. And before I introduce today's guest, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Ottawa and CIPS is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And we therefore pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So welcome once again to today's seminar. It gives me a very special pleasure to welcome Per Schouten, who is our guest today. I've been an admirer of Per's work for a very long time, and I know we can always expect something special when he publishes a new paper, or in this case, a new book. Per Schouten is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, or DIS, in Copenhagen in Denmark. He is also an associate researcher at the International Peace Information Service. He is the author of a great number of articles and papers on the political economy of conflict, mostly in Africa. And one of the things that I really admire about his work is that he has this unique ability to do very detailed, thick description, very beautiful ethnography, but at the same time speak to broader audiences with a theoretical sophistication that is quite enviable. So I'm quite sure that we are in for a treat today when he's going to speak to us about his Cambridge University Press book, Roadblock Politics, The Origins of Violence in Central Africa. So just before I hand over to Per, let me remind you that you have the privilege to be able to pose questions to Per. So there's at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A box, so you can post your questions and your comments there, and we will try and get through as many of them as we possibly can afterwards. So with that, welcome to everyone, and a very special welcome to Per Schouten. Over to you.
Thank you, Rita, for that generous introduction. And obviously the problem with generous introductions is that it's difficult for speakers to live up to them. But that said, I'll try and do my best. So what I'm going to do here today, and I'm going to start sharing my screen while I do so, is present my book, or at least the synopsis of my new book, Roadblock Politics, The Origins of Violence in Central Africa. And what I'll do today, I'll split it up in kind of two parts. I'll talk about the title a bit first, Roadblock Politics. What do I mean by that? And then I'll explain a bit why I chose this subtitle, The Origins of Violence in Central Africa, and what it kind of entails. But to start explaining what I mean by roadblock politics, I will take you to Eastern Congo in 2013. And tell a little anecdote about Heineken, because as I was doing fieldwork for my dissertation in Eastern Congo, as a penniless grad student, I was asked by an organization if I could not make a small study and for them look at how a multinational company, I could pick anyone I wanted, what kind of security actors they are faced with in a context like Congo. And being a Dutch national myself, I chose the company Heineken, of which I knew that they had a market share of like 75% in Congo's booming beer market. And I did my PhD on private security, as Rita well knows, because she was in my advisory committee. So I expected private security companies perhaps to guard their premises, perhaps the police or the army on the payroll, until a friend of mine, Bonjean, told me, hey, why don't you look at M23? And so I asked him M23. I knew that with that he referred to the armed group, the March 23 movement, that at that time was causing havoc in Eastern Congo, but I didn't quite see the connection with Heineken. And he told me, well, this beer, of course, is available in every village in Eastern Congo. How does it get there, and what does it do to get there? And to kind of substantiate his story, he said, well, here's a receipt. And what you see here, I'm not sure if it's clear for you on the screen, but you see on the kind of top left, you see the logo of M23, the armed group we were talking about. And this is a receipt that's issued at one of their checkpoints. It says, there might be bilingual people here, Nature de la Marchandise Primus, and Primus is like the main brand that Heineken is selling in Congo, its most popular beer. It says montant en chiffres, $320 US, and lieu et signature du taxateur at Kibumba. And that's the name of one checkpoint that M23 operated in Eastern Congo. Now, as it turns out, M23, when it kind of entered Congo in 2012, it aggressively sought to occupy key bottlenecks along trade routes where most of the flows of aid and trade and also minerals pass through. So instead of focusing their control on mining sites or minerals, M23 just occupied a few points of passage and levied taxation on everything that passed, including, as it turned out, Heineken beer. Now, this particular anecdote or incident for me raised a number of bigger questions. For instance, if this is just one company and one armed group, what if you look at all companies and all checkpoints? I had done quite a bit of field work before, and in order to reach mining sites that I was doing research on, I had to pass sometimes 30, 40 roadblocks. And in hindsight, I started to wonder, how significant are these roadblocks in relation to mining sites when it comes to our understanding of conflict financing in this part of the world? It also raised deeper questions. What if the frameworks we use to understand conflict, to understand the state even in this part of the world, is perhaps handicapped in a way by the kind of consistent focus on population and territory? Perhaps there's something going on there which we can't see, which is happening in Central Africa, but that needs that requires a different kind of form of articulation. So over the following years, I teamed up with a Belgian research institute, IPIS, and a whole lot of local researchers that eventually also became close friends. And we mapped over 1,500 different roadblocks or checkpoints across 3 countries in Central Africa. We started with Eastern Congo, pictured here on the left, where we mapped over 800 roadblocks in just 2 of Eastern Congo's provinces. And if we mapped 800, and you can see these dots kind of on the map, it isn't because there isn't more in these provinces. You can see some parts of the provinces which are just shaded green and there's no checkpoints. But that's only because we kind of ran out of money. So very likely there are probably more roadblocks there. After Eastern Congo, we moved to the Central African Republic, where we mapped over 300 roadblocks along the country's main trade routes, over half of which are under control of armed groups. And then finally, and this is not part of the book, we also continued to South Sudan, where we mapped an equal number of checkpoints along the kind of main trade routes in the country, which are also, and not incidentally, the main kind of arteries through which international aid flows. I'm afraid today we won't have time to dig into all of these cases, and even though the roadblocks look pretty much the same physically, the politics in each of these contracts are very, very different. So what I want to do is kind of focus on Congo, and I think that the context is so rich that it kind of allows us to explore most of the kind of diversity in the forms of politics that I think are at stake when we talk about roadblocks. So back to M23. As it turned out, later on, the armed group made in the period of around a year that it occupied these trade routes in Eastern Congo about 200,000 in checkpoint taxes alone, making the kind of business model of checkpoint, of running checkpoints, a very sustainable business model for any kind of aspiring rebel movement. And just to show how important roadblocks were to the considerations of the armed group itself, the UN reported when they called some of the paperwork of this armed group that in July, and I quote, the chief of finance of the M23, Erasto Bahati, wrote a memo complaining that the activities of the Mai Mai and Nyatura groups, other rebel groups, were decreasing traffic to its territory and consequently leading to a loss in taxes. Now below, what you see pictured is here a picture I took of part of the paperwork that the UN and the Congolese army captured from another rebel group called the FDLR, also a quite notorious rebel group in Eastern Congo, in which roadblock operators from the armed group kind of report to the hierarchy of why they haven't sent so much money to the commanders. And they say that's because, you know, actually everybody should pay about $10 at the checkpoints, but since a couple of months, people have started to avoid checkpoints that they operate. So in other words, roadblocks are quite central to the considerations that armed groups themselves have about what their operations are about. And I just want to kind of delve into why that might be. If you're a militia or a rebel group, you have a number of objectives, right? I mean, you're under arms full time, so you cannot make your own food, which means that you need to use your weapons to procure your own food. And you probably have enemies. The state is likely one among them. So you kind of want to be intractable to your enemies, be able to pack up and leave whenever it's necessary. And from that kind of perspective of a guerrilla like organization, roadblocks are really ideally suited, because all it requires is this kind of nimble cord, which you can kind of like put over the road and basically wait for people who want to pass, and then force them to pay. If you are not convinced that your presence enough and the kind of cord is enough, you can of course take a Kalashnikov with you and kind of put it on your shoulder nonchalantly to state your point. And even if you didn't bring your cord, you can source locally and just use some branches, as you see here on this picture of a checkpoint. Now, that means that roadblocks have a very kind of low entry barrier cost. They're quite easy, you know, anyone with a kind of Kalashnikov and a piece of rope can pull it off. And that has implications, I think, bigger implications for theoretical debates about how we think about conflict financing. I mean, Congo is kind of the schoolbook example of the conflict mineral debate, which argues in a kind of simplified version that a country richly endowed with mineral resources will thereby be more likely to suffer from conflict, because minerals constitute such a nice and easily lootable resource. Now, I've been to many artisanal mining sites, and this is a picture of one of them. And how does this look? I mean, you see about hundreds, maybe thousands of artisanal miners, people very much attached to their freedom, who really do hard physical labor to obtain just a little bit of money a day. So how easy does one think it is to kind of try to control this mine and loot these mineral resources? Actually, it's a quite intensive process to do so. So from the perspective of rebels, it's actually much easier to set up a kind of roadblock at the kind of entry pathway to such a mining site and force everyone who wants to pass simply to kind of pay up as they enter or exit the mine. And in fact, that is exactly what people do. State agents, as well as rebel organizations, set up roadblocks at mining sites, but they don't really discriminate between minerals and other kinds of goods, which is why they also put their roadblocks anywhere else where there is some kind of flow that can be taxed. So instead of lootable resources, I think one has to consider from the kind of perspective of an armed group, they are more interested in obstructable sources of wealth. I talked to one rebel who was kind of doubling as an army commander in Congo, let's call him Jean, and he told me, the first thing you do when you're deployed is you put up a kind of a cover against the rain. And the second thing you do is to create a roadblock to make some money and to get some food. Now he really seems to speak for all rebels in Congo. What you see here is a map of just showing roadblocks in the province of North Kivu. And just the kind of dots of these roadblocks is possibly a better indication of where the road network is than all the maps which are produced by NGOs or the UN of this part of Congo. So there really literally isn't a road where there isn't a roadblock. What does this kind of density of roadblock mean for people who live in a place like this? To be honest, it's quite devastating, actually. I mean, imagine you're a farmer, women or men, and you come from your field, with your harvest. In order to kind of translate that into usable income, you will have to take it to the market. And what typically happens is that as you leave your field, you carry your produce on your head. Just as you exit the field, there will be on this footpath, there will be perhaps a roadblock by the community militia, who will just ask you to give them a kind of small in-kind tax. And then you maybe go over the hill, and on your way to the village, there will be a military checkpoint who will do the same, ask you for a small amount of money or the kind of equivalent of that amount of money in kind. And so on your way to the market, you may pass 4, 5, up to 10 different roadblocks. So that by the time that you get to the market, you've walked 10, maybe 15, maybe 20 kilometers. And you come across the last roadblock operator, in this case, the Nyatura rebels in Eastern Congo, who come with their measure. This cup that he's carrying is the measure of produce that people have to pay. There's not much left than to just break out and cry. And what is especially maddening is that there's no kind of single center of authority, no center of power which steers this topography or this geography of roadblocks. There's no one authority that is in control of them, but instead there's multiple centers of power. It's really this kind of decentralized finance mechanism that imposes itself structurally on road users. I think all of this might just be of interest for country experts, development economists, or regional experts, if it wasn't for where we started, this anecdote about Heineken, right? I mean, this is a map of Congo showing the breweries that Heineken has. How does it work? How does a kind of multinational company navigate this very complex landscape of armed groups and roadblocks? I mean, here superimposed, you have the latest map of the Kivu security tracker of all the armed groups that we know the existence of in Eastern Congo. And of course, this kind of patchwork geography of control and predation poses a phenomenal problem for companies that wish to operate in such a place. So I started to dig a little bit into how this works, and it turns out that in order to understand how a multinational company like Heineken, but it could be Nestlé, it could be Coca-Cola, it could be Ericsson or Huawei, who provide antennas in a lot of countries where states don't control the road network. How do they navigate these kind of fractured checkpoint landscapes? As it turns out, they don't do so directly. And to understand what is going on, you need to understand something about logistics and how outsourcing has kind of led to a really burgeoning logistical market in places like Central Africa. Here, what you see is the map that Bolloré, a French logistics giant with a large market share in Africa, that it presents to its clients. And it shows in these kind of red lines what is called in the branch total logistics, which means that the company claims that they, from port to market to end consumer, they will provide logistical services. And it claims to provide so for basically covering quite large parts of the continent. But in reality, this map is fictional, because Bolloré itself is just hugging the kind of coastlines, and it has some dedicated railways. But moving inland, it itself outsources logistics to another set of regional or national transport operators with perfectly politically incorrect names as Imperial Logistics or Frontier Logistics Service, and who market their own services with kind of problematic colonial tropes like moving cargo where others don't dare in the heart of Africa. Things would still be quite simple if it wasn't for the fact that these companies in turn also outsource logistics to national logistics operators, trucking companies basically, who might be politically well connected, or just simply to individual truckers who might own one or a handful of trucks. And so by the time that you get to the encounter of a truck laden with global commodities or international aid and a roadblock operator, you've passed like 4 or 5 layers of outsourcing between this global corporate entity and the kind of checkpoint operator. And now all these layers of outsourcing involve the kind of rendering invisible of the costs associated to that checkpoint encounter. It seems like, from this presentation up to this point, that this is an endemic problem for Africa, but I think things are a bit more complicated. Only just a month ago, this map was released, and it is an illustration based on an internal memo that was leaked by the company Ericsson, where it explained that in Iraq, there is a legal route, which is here pointed out in green, which is a government-controlled road. But the checkpoints run by the government are administratively cumbersome and slow. So instead, Ericsson and probably many other companies as well prefer to take what was called the speedway, which was a lot quicker, but it turns out it involved payments to ISIS. And so Ericsson has, according to Citibank, become uninvestable for the near future. So what we're talking about is a phenomenon with possibly a global purchase, whereby multinational companies, through these kind of layers of outsourcing, are able to operate in places where before they were not, wouldn't be able to operate, but that involves them paying structurally to rebel roadblocks. Now, to put this a bit into perspective, what does this mean for how we think of the states and governance? This is a picture of the Central African Republic. Some people would call it flyover country, because a lot of Central Africa is just quite big forests, huge empty lands, savannas, swamps, with perhaps scattered villages here and there. And from the perspective of a kind of aspiring state, does it make sense to kind of deploy tax agents and soldiers and police agents to all these kind of little hamlets? Does it make sense to try to control your whole territory and population? And this question is quite pertinent, because even the kind of rebel governance literature tends to define rebels as serious rebel groups only if they control a population within a defined territory for a public purpose. And I'm quoting from a recent volume on rebel governance there. So the kind of specter of the state, of how we tend to think about states when they are successful, is really influenced by the specter of territory and population. But instead, faced with this kind of large territory, I believe it makes much more sense for states as well as rebels to focus on these kind of narrow points along the trade routes where people with value anyway would have to pass. And I think that the historical record largely agrees with me there. This picture is of the Kingdom of Congo about 500 years ago on the western side of the continent, and you see written on the kind of upper side and a bit to the side there, Yaka. And according to Jan van Sina, who is the kind of foremost historian of this area, in 1568, if I'm not wrong, the Yaka were the first. There was the first recorded instance of people purposefully attacking another community simply for the purpose of taking over control over this kind of strategic bottleneck along a trade route. And ever since, this process has only intensified, on par with the intensification of long-distance trade and the caravan trade as it penetrated into Central Africa. So what I do in the book, based on the kind of two main routes into Central Africa, is to show how communities over the centuries start to move towards the trade routes, start fighting over these specific bottlenecks or strategic points of passages along them, and there install a form of polities which are based first and foremost over the power to translate control over this bottleneck into resources, financial, political, or symbolic, which they could use to kind of bolster their own power vis-a-vis competitors. And really, if you read any kind of 19th century travelogue of explorers, particularly so in East Africa, from the trade route that goes from Zanzibar inwards to the Congo, it is really this kind of almost repetitive description of encounters between these explorers who, portray themselves as very heroic, and these endless series of local chiefs and communities which levy something in Swahili called hongo, which meant transit taxes. So in the 19th century, what you really see is that state formation itself, a key factor in the process of state formation in the 19th century, is about the metastasizing of these checkpoint levying communities along the trade routes that move into Central Africa. Now, what I'm trying to show there is that roadblocks are not just a contemporary phenomenon, but actually are something that roadblock politics occurs in most places and times where states don't control the entirety of the trade routes that in their area. And in this sense, I believe that it's really important to underscore that Africa is not unique. I mean, this is a picture of London in 1853. And it turns out that in the Great Britain of that time, there were a stunning 8,000 toll gates and turnpikes. In other words, wherever, even in the kind of prehistory of the state in Europe, before the kind of onset of the Industrial Revolution and the Transport Revolution, setting up shop along roads and taxing passing wealth was really what states specialized in. If Great Britain is an outlier, even in France, there were about 4,000 toll gates and checkpoints through which the French state and local authorities levied taxes on the movement of local commodities. And the colonial state, too, largely specialized, especially initially, in the levying of these kind of transport taxes over commodities that moved across the kind of interface between local economies and international trade. This picture here shows Leopold II as a roadblock operator. It's a caricature produced by the Dutch, who were excluded by Leopold II's trade barriers from trading in inland in the Congo Free State. Now this lasted for a very long time, until the Belgians started to colonize the physical environment of their colony through transport infrastructure. And from that point onwards, it became impossible to forge power out of control over these local points of passage for people inside this territory. But this period in which transport was kind of the internal tract of a kind of colonial administration, in hindsight, only lasted for a very short period, because as Congo became independent and the independent Congolese government could not use forced labor, could not oblige its population like the colonial administration did to maintain this large transport network through forced labor, the transport network of the Congo and other colonies around it started to degrade very, very rapidly. And with that, of course, the kind of infrastructural power of the state, or the kind of capacity of the state to send troops and administrative personnel throughout these vast territories diminished very, very, very quickly. And with that, what I call the kind of revenge of distance, it became possible once again to manufacture power out of the friction of terrain and the kind of local control of bottlenecks along trade routes. And I want to end with this picture, which shows a category of roadblock operators which we never quite could place. You know, there were rebel roadblocks, there were soldier roadblocks, administrative roadblocks, customary roadblocks. We mapped them all, but there was around 20% of the roadblocks in Congo we found that were just youngsters from the local communities who claimed to be repairing the road. So they would stand by a hole in the road or a piece of mud or a puddle, and they would stand with a shovel and say, you know, actually we're fixing the road. But as it turns out, what was going on in areas like in Eastern Congo, where there's a lot of different communities, and the relationship between these communities are quite tense. Often there's a lot of frictions around land, identity, access to resources. If there's a truck passing with commodities, or if it's an NGO that's passing, this leads to anxieties over where's this truck going? You know, will it stop here? And what will be the impact? Will it go to the neighboring community? And will it then, you know, lead to disparities in wealth or in access or opportunities? So these roadblocks are less a way of extracting wealth from the movement over long distances of goods and concentrated value, but more a kind of frontier of resistance against the nefarious impacts that the trade and the movement of things, concentrated wealth over long distances, can have on these kind of fractured ecosystems of communities that live in a balance of unease with one another. And I think that from the kind of looking back and understanding that there's this long legacy of roadblocks that existed in pre-colonial times that were kind of the basis of power for communities in this part of the world, these kind of community roadblocks make sense a lot more from that perspective. So what I want to end up saying, and I really appreciate your patience, and I'm looking very much forward to your questions, is that what I'm trying to do is to show in this book that roadblocks are not just a kind of empirical phenomenon that's very widespread in Central Africa, but very likely also beyond it. But it's also a site which concentrates enormously dense politics, symbolic politics, financial politics, but also questions of identity and resistance, which are all bundled into these very small sites in the landscape. With that, I want to end my presentation. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Per. That was really interesting. You did live up to the introduction. This floor, so to speak, the virtual floor is open for questions. You can post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But let me start, Per, because you know there's so many things we can discuss here, but one of the sort of big questions that you leave me with is, What's the end point of this, right? When you draw your historical comparison to London and Europe and the way in which entry into the markets were controlled in the same way or in a similar way to the roadblocks that you described so vividly in the DRC, the endpoint became the centralized state, right? But when I listen to you now describing the roadblocks in Central Africa, I wonder if we're looking at a situation of endless fragmentation. Could you speak a little bit more to where you see this logic leading us? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Rita. That's a brilliant question. I think that definitely, if you look at Eastern Congo, the empirical track record is such that unfortunately we have witnessed endless fragmentation over the last 20 years because a lot of armed groups mobilize are actually communities mobilizing against the structural predation by the armed forces. Even going back 2 decades, when Congo was, or 3 decades, when Congo was Zaire, this was what the armed forces did. You know, they weren't paid any longer. So the Forces Armées Zaroises were really notorious for the abuses and in filling their pockets at the checkpoints. So a lot of the kind of community mobilizations that went against them, the first armed groups, the first Mai armed groups, were in fact against that structural predation by the agents of the state. And but any time that an armed group mobilizes against checkpoints and maybe takes them away, then they will put their own checkpoints just as a measure of security, and also because of the symbolic politics of the state, right? That, you know, this is what you see the state doing. So then, in order to be respected and to be taken seriously, you will also mount a checkpoint. And that in turn becomes an incentive. You know, they understand, okay, we're making money with this. And so it becomes a dynamic kind of goal in itself for an armed group. And then other people from the community might feel disenfranchised and say, well, this wasn't the purpose of this mobilization. It was actually to defend us from these kind of extractions. And this might lead to a schism in the armed group or to kind of counter mobilization within the community to take away now these checkpoints by this armed group. And so, and then there's of course the thing that if this militia is from one community, then the community next door might feel threatened by the fact that they see the kind of wealth or power or symbolic power of this community increasing, and then they will also start to mount roadblocks as a kind of to equalize this kind of regional balance of power system. So that's definitely something which is going on, but it's quite unique for Congo, I would say. In the Central African Republic and South Sudan, you do not see this kind of fragmentation and proliferation of public authority around space of circulation, but instead you see a quite stable system whereby armed groups will, yes, fight for over roadblocks, but they won't increase the number of roadblocks. And there's very kind of clear rules of engagement around who can be taxed, right? Mostly geared towards foreign truckers, foreign aid companies, so rebels in the Central African Republic or in South Sudan would never tax a girl going to the farm with, you know, going to the market with the local produce on her head. So the kind of politics you see around roadblocks are very different in very context, and I think that Congo is quite unique with this kind of endless fragmentation of control over the road and space of circulation.
Wonderful. I have a question from the audience, which I will read to you. It says, thank you very much for an extremely interesting presentation. In light of the information, can we see these roadblocks as an inevitable phenomenon that should be lived with rather than dismantled? Or in your view, is there anything that can be and should be done to dismantle the networks?
It's a very good question. I think it's also one of the first questions I get when I talk to people inside the United Nations or donors. They're like, so what can we do about this, right? And the UN mission in Congo actually said, can you give us the coordinates so and then we can do some patrols and take these roadblocks away, right? So I was like, I'm not afraid I cannot do that. But it's a very valid question because, okay, we have now identified a phenomenon, which is structural predation. It's one of the first things that people mention in conflict zones. If you ask them, what's the effect of conflict? They will say it's the increase in the taxes, to move around. Products are more expensive in the market. So it's a very valid question to say, well, and now what, right? I tend to be very cautious, first of all, because I'm an academic and I've studied interventions like you have as well, Rita, and interventions do not have a very good track record in the first place. And then second of all, I'm a bit afraid of the answer to the question, what's the alternative? So if you take away checkpoints as a source of funding, I am afraid that armed groups will find other ways to make up for the loss in income, and that roadblocks might be a quite stable interface of predation, one which is largely geared towards international actors rather than local economies, which I think is better. It's better if wealthy foreign people are taxed than local poor people. And I'm afraid that if you take it away, the stable interface of predation, that armed actors might resort to more unpredictable and violent forms of wealth extraction, like kidnapping or holdups, which eventually would kind of lead to more instability and chaos. And also, there's another perspective on roadblocks, which is much more benign, taken by the head of a UN mission and I cannot name him because it's an off-the-record company. He says, yes, these checkpoints, they're just another way of putting money into the local community. And that perspective is quite benign, and I found it quite refreshing because the people who operate the checkpoints, they also have to spend the money, and they will likely buy beer or spend it on to put their kids through school. They spend it on food with the local people who make food. So it is a mechanism that makes wealth circulate. It just doesn't do so in the way that we're used to thinking about how wealth should circulate, and we might not be in agreement that it's the people who have guns that decide, right, or are the kind of main interface of making this money circulate in the way that they want to, rather than people who do not have guns, right? So I think that's I think some of the things that are in play, right, in trying to answer this question. I'm not sure if that's helpful, but.
Yes, it is helpful. It's very interesting. And so just a reminder to people to keep your questions coming. You mentioned the international companies and you spoke specifically about Heineken. I wonder if you could just say more about how the companies themselves think about their own need to pay tolls at these roadblocks, and also relatedly, there's been several kind of efforts by the international community to have, boycott companies that trade in or are involved in conflict minerals. Based on your analysis, is there some kind of point to those kinds of efforts to intervene? So consumer boycotts and the international involvement of the companies?
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult one. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, multinational companies would only operate in other countries if it would be guaranteed by states. So if states would offer escorts or could guarantee the security for these companies to operate there. But what you see now is that this is completely gone. So multinational companies no longer require security kind of assurances from host governments, but instead are quite happy to operate in places where states do not control their territory or their road network. And it seems that supply chain capitalism, as it has been called, is part and parcel of that. The idea that you can outsource the risks involved in operating in these places to local operators, but instead, so you insource the wealth, but you outsource the risks associated to navigating these spaces onto informal actors. So as these states became, due to structural adjustment, many of the states of the economies in this part of the world became radically informalized in the 70s and 80s. And many of the kind of informal actors that emerged out of that are now the foot soldiers of global supply chains. And I fear that it is very difficult to come out of this because companies do not want to know about how things get done on the ground. There was a survey, I believe, from PricewaterhouseCoopers that showed just before the pandemic hit, that firms who sit on the top of these global supply chains do not have insight beyond the first layer of suppliers or contractors. They do not know, right? And they do not wish to know, I believe. It's only possible to live in a system where the garment industry is premised on labor abuses and many kind of soya products, for instance, are taken out of forest frontiers, and where global companies make profits by basically selling consumer goods in war zones. If companies are made responsible for the whole supply chain. I mean, we're trying to do this for minerals with the Dodd-Frank Act in the US, for instance, which requires companies who use who have minerals in their supply chain that might come from conflict areas in Congo. They are required to report each year due diligence on where these minerals come from and if they might be sourcing from conflict zones. And 70% of the companies cannot even confirm or deny whether the products they source come from Congo or not. So supply chains are purposefully opaque, I believe. And I think that governments are very much aware of this. There was in Europe a proposal for corporate accountability for human rights abuses in supply chains outside of Europe that was drafted last year. It should have been adopted, but it keeps on being postponed because maybe it's lobbying pressure, maybe it's also government pressure, because we are, I think, aware uncomfortably that we cannot source so much cheap products and we cannot make these kind of profits that we are used to if companies are to be held accountable for what conspires further down or up the supply chain.
Super, thank you, Per. I have a couple of more questions here. So the first one for you is about the gender perspective. And we saw the picture you had of the young woman who was breaking down in tears after having been taxed so many times. So the question is, from a gender perspective, was the idea of, or the question of gender-biased sexual violence part of the study, and how are there gender aspects to the way in which people are taxed in these roadblocks?
I think that's a fundamental question, and one which has not ceased to fascinate me, actually, but which I have been afraid to fully address because it is such a sensitive question, and I'll explain why. These youngsters I showed operating a roadblock, even this girl crying, right, in front of a rebel who operates a roadblock. Oftentimes, these roadblock operators and the people who they interface with know each other very well, and because of the proliferation of roadblocks, men have ceased to take to the market, and instead, women. They've pushed forward their wives as the one to move to the market because it was supposed a couple of years back, or a decade back even, that women would be less subjected to roadblock harassments and taxation. So now often it's groups of women who take to the road, which used to be a masculine space, but now it's increasingly women who are moving outside the villages, and it's men who stay in the villages. But what is the really fascinating point here is that the roadblock operators are often young men from the same community. So what you have is older men who families who own land, and younger men who perhaps do not have an avenue to grow and to obtain status in the community, who are extracting wealth from the more established people in the village who are able to create a surplus out of farming. And it feels that women are becoming a kind of interface of this generational struggle over questions of social advancement, over questions of hierarchy within the community. So it's extremely complicated questions that involve militarization, militias, generational questions. How do the young men who operate the roadblock relate to these elders, which are supposed to have status in the community, right? So these are very, very sensitive questions that I think require a lot more research. And of course, I've tried to address them throughout, and the questions of gender run through the book for sure. But I think that they merit a lot more research, right? And often the best these kind of research questions come out of the initial research as it advances.
Thank you, Per. I have a question from Michael Williams, who is somebody you know well. He asks, what are the relations between these groups and state forces? Are they wholly autonomous, where state forces are just another kind of roadblock actor? Or are there connections or agreements about spheres of control, distribution of resources, rules of engagement or negotiation between the various informal and formal groups?
Wow, that's a large question. I think the answer depends. It's a bit context specific. What I can say though, Mike, it's nice to meet you again, is that it is quite fascinating that just a stone's throw difference, just a stone's throw away, you often find the army and the people they're supposed to be attacking, but they can be there for months or years on end, and they seem to have reached a kind of agreement on non-engagement because they both profit from the fact that the other is there to be able to mount their roadblock in the first place, right? So the fact that there's an enemy is, of course, very important for the pretext to be able to operate a roadblock in many contexts. In other contexts, the army is deployed along a road which cuts through a forest as part of, for instance, stabilization work or UN state building. And the soldiers are very much aware that, you know, they're just 3 soldiers. They know that the area is basically under control of a community militia. And so in order to ensure their own security, what they will do is often pay off the rebels, so that an army roadblock, which is there meant to kind of be a beacon of state authority against these rebels, depends for its own security on accommodations with these kind of rebel groups. This is an outlier, which is quite structural in Congo, but in the Central African Republic and South Sudan, such the kind of borderlines between state control and rebel control seem to be much more of a classical conflict type. So the state really just controls a few routes, and the rest of the roads are under control of armed groups. And it's really quite clear divisions of control over logistical space, which are also part and parcel of the struggle between the groups and the state, because the Central African government is just deprived of all these taxes that it used to get only, and I repeat, only from the taxation of commodities, tropical hardwood and diamonds and coffee along these routes, and which are now falling or financing armed rebellion against that state.
Fascinating, thank you. Just a follow-up question, and I think this will be our last question. The struggle, you say, but what are these groups struggling for? If it's not about land and territory and people or seizing the government, but it's merely about control of resources, what is the struggle about in these different settings?
yes, I'm afraid to disappoint in the sense that these struggles are very contextually specific. But it is important to remember that even if the struggles might be around other issues, the struggles advance along roads as well. The deployment of armies anywhere in the world, as you can see in Ukraine as well, right, on the kind of maps that are published, it's about roads. And so roads are the strategic spaces, the arteries of war and trade. And so any kind of conflict, whether it's the Dinka occupying parts of Equatoria, will advance along roads, and so will materialize in the form of checkpoints. And so the stakes and significance of these checkpoints and the occupation of logistical space might be related to questions of identity and internal colonization, but they manifest through and work through checkpoints and control over, strategic points of passage, rather than territorial expanses, right? I think it's slightly different for those places in Central Africa where transhumance or pastoralist herding is a dominant livelihood activity, because there are not these kind of fixed points through which herd moves. Of course, there's transhumance routes, and control over those is a factor of conflict as well. But each season, as the landscape dries up, these routes might differ, right? But there again, I mean, a lot of the armed mobilizations in the Central African Republic and South Sudan revolve around questions of cattle mobility and who is able to facilitate access to pastures along certain routes, and to translate that control over that access into a form of wealth extraction to be imposed on these herding populations. And that's quickly turning into a frontier of conflict financing that is growing very much as climate change is forcing these pastoralist herders to seek greener pastures towards the south of the Sahel. But that's, I think, a different discussion.
Thank you so much, Per. I said at the beginning that I thought we were in for a treat, and I think we have delivered. It's been wonderful to listen to you. We had only an hour for today, so we have unfortunately come to our end, but I look forward to having you back at CIPS in not too long. I wish you all the very best. I know you're going on a big book tour with your book, so we look forward to reading it and hearing about it. But for now, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to CIPS. I'd like to thank Per Schouten for giving us his wonderful talk and all his insights. And then before we go, just to wish everyone a warm welcome back to CIPS again. Do check our website and our Twitter account. We have lots of events going on almost every day. It's certainly every week. So I hope to see you back in not too long. Thank you and bye for now.
Thank you so much for having me over. It was really a pleasure.